President Trump, Ukraine cannot trade NATO membership for rare earth minerals agreement with the U.S. Today, April 4th, during an address from the Oval Office, U.S. President Donald Trump emphasized that Ukraine would not be able to secure NATO membership by offering concessions on a rare earth minerals agreement with the United States. I heard that President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine stated he would only sign the agreement if Ukraine were accepted into NATO, or something along those lines. But that issue was never part of the discussion, Trump stated. He further noted that Russia has opposed Ukraine's NATO membership since before President Vladimir Putin was first elected in 2000, suggesting this opposition may be a root cause of the ongoing conflict. President Zelensky had previously proposed a minerals cooperation agreement as part of his victory plan, unveiled last year to garner American support. Despite various proposals from the Trump administration since taking office, both sides have yet to finalize the deal. President Trump warned that Zelensky would face very serious problems if he continued to back away from the rare earth minerals agreement. On Ukraine's side, Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha said Kyiv is currently in consultation with Washington to finalize a mutually acceptable document. Sybiha revealed that Ukraine received a new draft of the so-called Mineral Resources Agreement from the U.S. through diplomatic channels on March 28. Ukraine had been prepared to sign a previously developed framework agreement but received a new proposal that requires additional review and development. The Ukrainian top diplomat confirmed that Ukraine has already completed the first round of consultations and is committed to signing a document that aligns with the national interests of both countries. He also noted that the deal would increase the presence of major American companies in Ukraine and contribute to the country's security infrastructure. President Zelensky later confirmed that the mineral agreement currently under negotiation with Washington contains no references to NATO membership. There is no mention of NATO. Never was, he said. We will make a decision in a few days. The office of the President of Ukraine also confirmed to the Kyiv Independent that there is no linkage between the agreement and NATO membership, calling reports to the contrary a misunderstanding. However, Zelensky stated that Ukraine's accession to the European Union is still under discussion and asserted that Kyiv would not accept any mineral resource agreement that compromises the country's EU membership prospects.
European leaders meet to discuss Ukraine peace and defense amid U.S. security shifts. On March 12th, defense leaders from France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Poland, and Italy convened in Paris to discuss peace efforts in Ukraine and the broader European defense strategy. The meeting comes as concerns grow over the U.S.'s evolving security commitments to the region. The defense ministers of these 5 nations, Europe's largest defense spenders, reaffirmed their continued support for Ukraine, even in the event of a ceasefire or peace agreement with Russia, but stopped short of committing to troop deployments for enforcing such an agreement. According to Defense News, when questioned about the potential deployment of troops to Ukraine, French Armed Forces Minister Sébastien Lecornu stated, "Media narratives evolve faster than diplomatic and military decision-making." NATO data projects that these 5 nations will collectively spend an estimated $314 billion on defense in 2024. 30-day ceasefire proposal and European pressure on Russia. The meeting followed the March 11th backing by the U.S. and Ukraine of a 30-day ceasefire proposal in Saudi Arabia, which is currently awaiting a response from Russia. UK Defense Secretary John Healey underscored that the agreement between the US and Ukraine represents a crucial diplomatic step, adding that the responsibility now lies with Russian President Vladimir Putin to demonstrate a genuine commitment to peace. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius echoed these sentiments, emphasizing that the next move depends on Russia. He reiterated that European nations do not wish for a peace agreement reminiscent of the 1945 Yalta Conference, which divided Europe into spheres of influence. Pistorius also referenced the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine relinquished its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees, and the 2014 to 2015 Minsk agreements, which established ceasefires but lacked concrete security assurances. Europe strengthens defense and reduces dependence on the U.S. French Defense Minister Lecornu stressed that demilitarizing Ukraine is not an option. and that the best way to ensure the country's security is by reinforcing its armed forces. Meanwhile, Polish Defense Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz argued that supporting Ukraine is also about keeping Russia further away from European borders. Military chiefs from the 5 nations have begun drafting short and medium-term strategic scenarios to help policymakers shape a security framework for Ukraine. Immediate priorities include safeguarding the Black Sea region and protecting Ukraine's nuclear power plants. Lecornu noted that European security faces ongoing threats from Russia, as well as the unpredictability of U.S. foreign policy shifts. U.S. strategic pivot spurs calls for European military autonomy. German Defense Minister Pistorius pointed out that America's strategic realignment away from Europe has been underway even before former President Donald Trump took office. However, the speed and extent of this shift remain uncertain. Pistorius urged European nations to move beyond adaptation and accelerate their efforts to bolster independent defense capabilities. He also called for a structured roadmap with the U.S. to ensure a phased transition of security responsibilities, minimizing potential gaps in defense readiness. UK Defense Secretary John Healey asserted that a stable Europe and a strong NATO also serve American interests. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin reaffirmed that increasing European defense capabilities does not equate to a U.S. withdrawal from Ukraine or European security commitments. The meeting took place amid growing discussions in the EU about reducing reliance on U.S. security support. On March 10th, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen proposed forming a European Defense Union to strengthen the continent's military autonomy. Speaking in Brussels on March 9th, she emphasized that Europe has entered a new era of geopolitical challenges, where sovereignty and international commitments are increasingly subject to transactional diplomacy. U.S. withdraws from Ukraine conflict investigation, moves toward normalizing relations with Russia. According to the New York Times, the U.S. Department of Justice has recently decided to withdraw from an investigation into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which was initiated by the International Criminal Justice Organization and led by the European Union, EU. The U.S. joined the organization in 2023, becoming its only non-European member. Sources indicate that Washington informed its European partners of this decision before making an official announcement. U.S. officials cited government budget cuts as the reason for the withdrawal. Previously, the U.S. Department of Justice had pledged $1 million in support of European investigators upon joining the organization. Additionally, the Biden administration is scaling back operations of the World Cat Group within the U.S. Department of Justice. This group was established in 2022 to train Ukrainian prosecutors in prosecuting and trying Russian nationals accused of war crimes. Last week, the U.S. also reduced funding for a Yale University research group that was investigating cases of Ukrainian children allegedly taken to Russia. Moscow has denied these accusations, claiming they are misinformation intended to discredit Russia's evacuation efforts from conflict zones. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump is focusing on normalizing bilateral relations with Russia, considering the resolution of the Ukraine conflict as a key step forward. The American leader is expected to hold a phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin this week to discuss the next steps in their diplomatic engagement.
Russia pushes Ukrainian forces out of Kursk, increases pressure on northern front. According to El País of Spain, the commander of the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Brigade confirmed that Ukraine's military command in Sumy province has lost contact with its garrison in Kursk, Russia. The commander stated that communication between Sumy-based commanders and Ukrainian forces in Kursk has been disrupted. El País reported that between 6,000 and 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers are currently surrounded in Kursk, with the primary goal being their evacuation. However, the presence of Russian drones, UAVs, aerial bombardments, and artillery fire has made movement towards Kursk nearly impossible. Russia expels Ukrainian forces from Kursk, secures all settlements. The New York Times reported that Russian forces have expelled Ukrainian troops from most settlements in Kursk. Currently, Ukrainian forces are retreating from nearly all directions, holding only a narrow strip of land along the border, covering less than 30 square miles. Military analyst Piri Paronen from the Blackbird Group, think tank in Finland, assessed that the battle in Kursk is reaching its final stage. Ukrainian soldiers stated that their objective is no longer to hold captured areas within Russian territory, but to secure strategic defensive positions to prevent Russian forces from advancing into Sumy and opening a new front. The Wall Street Journal noted that while Ukraine's withdrawal appears organized, signs of chaos persist. For some units, the retreat under heavy Russian fire has come too late. Recent images from Russian news agencies depict Russian forces capturing at least one M1 Abrams tank and several U.S.-supplied armored vehicles, with the remains of Ukrainian soldiers inside. Donetsk and Luhansk fronts see continued developments. On March 16th, Reuters cited Russian officials stating that Russian forces were expelling the last Ukrainian soldiers from Kursk, while simultaneously clearing large quantities of landmines in the region. Notably, not only has the Kursk front witnessed significant developments, but Russian forces have also made further gains in Donetsk. On March 16th, Russian state broadcaster 1TV announced that Russian forces had taken control of 4 settlements in Donetsk over the past week: Dzerzhinsk, Konstantinovka, Novomarkovo, and Koki. According to Lenta, Russian forces have also seized the settlement of Novy Lyubov in Luhansk and continued expanding their control in Kharkiv. These recent advances bring the total number of settlements captured by Russia since the start of its military campaign to 70. Potential Russian advance toward Kyiv after over 2 years of conflict. According to Lenta, Ukrainian forces are withdrawing from multiple directions. Speaking to the publication on March 17th, British military analyst Alexander Mercouris suggested that Russian operations in northern Ukraine could bring Russian troops closer to Kyiv, and he did not rule out the possibility of Moscow continuing its offensive in this region. Mercouris stated, "Current developments may bring Russian forces closer to Kyiv from a significantly stronger position compared to February and March 2022. Russian state news agency TASS reiterated earlier remarks by President Vladimir Putin in which he asserted that Russian forces had made advances across most battlefronts and were now in a favorable position to encircle large Ukrainian military formations.
Ukraine expects improved FPV drone supply by end of summer. According to Uninformed MD, the supply of FPV, first-person view, drones from the Ukrainian government to the country's armed forces is expected to improve significantly by the end of the summer. Commander of the 429th Independent UAV Regiment Achilles, Yuri Fedorenko, stated that the first drones under the government contract have just begun to be delivered this spring. We can affirm that most units using drones will be equipped with a minimum number of FPV drones, and by the end of the summer, we expect to reach parity with the enemy in several frontline areas, Fedorenko said. The commander also noted that 2 rounds of fundraising have already been conducted to implement the drone procurement plan. Currently, the Achilles Regiment is being equipped with FPV drones operated via radio signals supplied by the Ukrainian government. At the same time, more advanced models capable of autonomous navigation at certain altitudes, able to lock onto and approach targets without manual control, have been purchased independently. The operational speed of standard FPV drones remains steady at around 30 kilometers per hour. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces are learning to intercept enemy FPV drones using light weapons. Fedorenko revealed that several projects are currently being tested to disable FPV drones, though these trials will require more time to complete. These improvements come at a critical time, as Ukraine strives to enhance its technological capabilities on the battlefield to counter Russian attacks and increase the effectiveness of counteroffensives in key conflict zones. U.S. aims for Ukraine's ceasefire deal by April 20th, with Kyiv expected to recognize new borders. On March 23rd, Bloomberg News cited a source stating that the United States hopes to reach a broad ceasefire agreement in the Russia-Ukraine war within the next few weeks, aiming for a formal ceasefire deal by April 20th. According to U.S. Presidential Envoy Stephen Goodson, the most critical issue in the peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine is the legal status of the territories, not only those currently controlled by Russian forces, but also areas still under Ukrainian control that were unilaterally annexed by Moscow in September 2022 and enshrined in Russia's constitution. These territories include Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, all of which have portions still held by Ukrainian forces. Moscow demands that Kyiv and the international community recognize these regions as part of Russia, making it a precondition for any peace deal. Goodson also confirmed that Ukraine's potential NATO membership has been removed from the agenda. Instead, an alternative being considered involves providing Ukraine with security guarantees similar to NATO's Article 5, which states that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all. Goodson suggested these 2 key topics, new borders and security guarantees, could be interconnected and reciprocal. He noted that most of the annexed regions are Russian-speaking and had held referendums in which a majority voted to join the Russian Federation. This, he said, is the crux of the conflict and the first issue that must be resolved. He stated that the U.S. would be willing to provide security assurances to Ukraine, but in exchange, Kyiv would need to recognize Russia's status over certain territories and formalize new internationally recognized borders through a peace treaty. Only by doing so can the conflict in Ukraine be resolved and a sustainable peace be achieved, Goodson emphasized. However, the cost of achieving peace and gaining Western security guarantees would be steep for Ukraine, a country devastated by war, a near-collapsed economy, and the loss of approximately 30% of its territory, including the entirety of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia.
France and the UK propose establishing a voluntary alliance to support Ukraine. French President Emmanuel Macron recently revealed details regarding the mission of a military support force for Ukraine, which France, the UK, and other allied nations are working together to establish. This force, named the Voluntary Alliance, could be deployed once a ceasefire agreement between Russia and Ukraine takes effect. Speaking to the press ahead of an online summit hosted by the UK on March 15th, President Macron emphasized that the plan does not involve deploying a large number of troops to Ukraine. Instead, military forces will be strategically positioned in key areas. According to French newspapers Le Figaro and Le Parisien, Macron stated that participating countries could deploy several thousand soldiers to strategic locations in Ukraine. The primary missions of this force would include training Ukrainian troops and supporting defensive operations, demonstrating a long-term commitment to Kyiv. Macron also highlighted that the proposed military units from NATO member states would serve as a security guarantee for Ukraine. Several European and non-European nations have expressed willingness to join this force if it is established. Le Parisien quoted Macron affirming that this deployment does not require Russia's approval. The French president stated, "Ukraine is a sovereign country. If they request allied forces to be present on their territory, Russia has no authority to decide against it." UK Prime Minister challenges Russian president to sign ceasefire agreement. Following the 2-hour online meeting, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer reportedly challenged Russian President Vladimir Putin to sign a ceasefire agreement if he is genuinely committed to peace. Starmer also asserted that the Western coalition would continue to increase pressure on the Kremlin, including preparing peacekeeping forces for deployment during the ceasefire implementation phase. Approximately 30 world leaders participated in the meeting, including Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and representatives from Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, as well as officials from NATO and the European Union, EU. This was the second such meeting in 2 weeks, aimed at helping Ukraine navigate shifting U.S. policies following Donald Trump's return to the White House, while assessing international support for potential peacekeeping missions in the future. According to Prime Minister Starmer, military experts will reconvene in the UK on March 20th to further discuss plans for future security assistance to Ukraine.
UK, France, and Ukraine to meet in coming days to advance security plans for Ukraine. On March 31st, a spokesperson for UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that military leaders from the UK, France, and Ukraine will meet in the coming days to push forward detailed plans aimed at strengthening long-term security for Ukraine. According to the spokesperson, Prime Minister Starmer and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky agreed in a recent phone call to organize the meeting as part of the next phase in accelerating security planning. The call followed a summit held in Paris on March 27, where around 30 European leaders, along with President Zelensky, gathered to discuss increasing military support for Ukraine and to define Europe's role in future peace negotiations aimed at ending the conflict. The UK Prime Minister's spokesperson emphasized that following the Paris meeting, leaders recognized a real momentum to ensure lasting security for Ukraine. In a separate statement, President Zelensky welcomed the UK's efforts to promote peace for his country. Meanwhile, on the same day, the Kremlin confirmed that Russian President Vladimir Putin remains willing to engage in dialogue with former U.S. President Donald Trump. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov noted that Russia and the United States are currently working on several ideas related to resolving the conflict in Ukraine, though the process will require more time. Earlier, President Trump expressed confidence that President Putin would honor his commitments and move toward an agreement to end the war with Ukraine.
France urges stronger pressure on Moscow. U.S.-Russia talks on negotiation process. On March 15th, U.S. Secretary of State Mark Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held a phone conversation to discuss the next phase of negotiations aimed at ending the Russia-Ukraine conflict. U.S. State Department spokesperson Tommy Bruce stated that both top diplomats agreed to continue efforts to restore communication channels between Washington and Moscow. The announcement did not specify the exact date for the next round of U.S.-Russia negotiations, which are being hosted by Saudi Arabia. Additionally, Secretary Rubio updated Minister Lavrov on military activities in the Middle East, where U.S. forces carried out airstrikes on March 15th targeting Houthi militant positions in Yemen. Despite recent tensions between U.S. President Donald Trump and his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky, Kyiv has agreed in principle to a 30-day unconditional ceasefire brokered by the U.S., provided that Moscow halts its offensive in eastern Ukraine. However, Russian President Vladimir Putin has yet to agree to any ceasefire. Instead, Moscow has outlined conditions that differ from those stated in the U.S.-Ukraine agreement. French President, increased pressure on Russia is necessary. On the same day, in a statement following an online meeting with Ukraine-supporting nations chaired by UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron emphasized that Russia has not demonstrated genuine commitment to peace. According to Macron, Russian President Vladimir Putin is escalating the conflict to gain battlefield advantages before entering negotiations. President Macron stated, "Russia needs to provide a clear response. We must also coordinate with the U.S. to apply stronger pressure on Moscow to achieve a ceasefire." Since returning to the White House in January, President Trump has expressed his desire to end the 3-year-long Ukraine conflict and has taken steps to improve relations with President Putin. Earlier, in an interview with local media on March 14th, published late on March 15th, President Macron warned that if Russia does not show a sincere commitment to peace, President Trump will tighten sanctions and take retaliatory measures. This would completely shift the dynamics of the situation, Macron asserted. According to the French president, planning is being expedited in countries willing to provide security assurances for Ukraine if a ceasefire agreement is signed, including the UK and France.